Er zijn 3 dingen in het leven van een kunstenaar. Ten eerste, te kunnen werken. Ten tweede, goed te kunnen werken. En ten derde, de grootst mogelijke weerklank bij zijn publiek te vinden.
Who's afraid of art? Tyrants and wannabe tyrants, so it seems.
Artist Alexandra Skochelenko has been sentenced to 7 years in prison by St. Petersburg's invasion, spreading false information, disinformation.
With autocracy growing, with tyrants on the roll, Balie brings together over 40 international artists, writers and thinkers during Forum on European Culture. We celebrate the subversive power of art and literature and curate works of opposition that preserve the histories autocrats want to erase and imagine the futures they fear.
So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Art against the tyrants. Not for the faint-hearted.
Good morning, it's Sunday, June 29. This is the Balie in Amsterdam. I'm Arnon Grunberg. A warm welcome to all of you in the audience and a warm welcome to those of you who are watching this program online from their houses, their caravans or their gardens. Before I will introduce my guest, Adam Phillips, a short introduction, a short summarization of what you can expect this morning. Those of you who have been here before know the drill. I will talk to my guest for about 60 minutes, 1 hour, 15 minutes. After that, there's a possibility to ask questions. There's Q&A. Jante Mosselman from the Balie will walk around with a mic. And I remind you once again that a question is a question and not a statement, not an opinion, not an anecdote from your personal life. I will be quite brutal. If you talk for more than 1 minute, I will interrupt you. You might ask, what is this in the back? This is a piece of art made by a Ukrainian refugee. His name is Nikita Kravtsov, and he's from Crimea. And I believe he's in Amsterdam, so you can talk to him later. I will introduce you, Adam. If I make mistakes, please let me know and interrupt me as well. Adam Phillips, born in 1954, is an essayist, a psychotherapist. He edited the New Penguin modern classic translations of Sigmund Freud, and he wrote a Freud biography as well. He has been compared to Bob Dylan. I'm not sure if that was based on his work or on his looks. Maybe both. But without wanting to offend anybody, I would like to suggest that Adam Phillips is better than Bob Dylan. He's also the author of several books. I will list a few of them. Monogamy, 1996, Houdini's Box, On the Arts of Escape, 2001, Going Sane, 2005, Unforbidden Pleasures, 2015, On Wanting to Change, 2021, On Getting Better, 2021, On Giving Up, 2024. I'd like to start with On Giving Up, your last book, one of your last books, and then I'd like to end with Monogamy, sure, because it's always good to end with Monogamy. We will see what we can get done in the meantime. Adam, on Giving Up, you start with Franz Kafka. He's, I believe, based on your work, quite an important author, also to you. And you start with a quote by Kafka. And the quote is, "From a certain point, there's no more turning back." And he wrote this. This is one of the Kafka's zero aphorisms. He wrote this between 1917 and 1918, shortly after he was informed that he was terminally ill. And then a few pages later, you write that, "For our purposes, I want to read Kafka's aphorism as, from a certain point, there is no more giving up. That's the point that must be reached." What kind of situation, what kind of place is this where there's no more giving up?
I think it's the point at which one is no more precipitated into a crisis of choice. It's as though the anxiety is having to make choices, and the wish then is to get beyond choice, as though the choice has been already made, and I can now take the consequence of this particular choice.
So there's nothing more to choose.
That's the wish.
That's the wish.
Yeah, it can't really be true, but you can see why it would be a wish.
Yeah. Because you said maybe having all kinds of choices gives you, as Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, would describe it, a dizziness of freedom.
Well, there's a temptation, I think, to simplify the complexity of our own minds. And so I think the drive for simplicity or for diminishing complication is very, very great. So there's a wish, I think, to get to the point at which one is not overwhelmed by how prolific one's own mind is. And at that point, of course, it isn't really a point, but it's an artifact. Then you can act. That's the idea, I think. As though the fear in the background is the excessive complexity of my own mind will stop me actually doing anything because there are too many contending or conflicting desires.
Would you say that desire and choice are basically the same, or could be the same, as synonyms?
Well, it obviously depends how you construe both these terms, but they could be seen to be opposites. In a certain psychoanalytic language, desire would be overdetermined internally, and therefore would not be the nature of a choice. Whereas choice might have a picture of it, of literally choosing between alternatives and relinquishing other ones. There's a famous story which you may know that Sartre tells in Being and Nothingness about the young couple. The young couple come down for breakfast every morning, and then the husband goes off to work, and the wife sits by the window crying all day. And when he returns, she perks up. Sartre says, well, the obvious interpretation is that this woman is suffering from a separation anxiety, but really she's suffering from a fear of freedom, because when her husband leaves, she can do whatever she wants. So that's like one paradigm of this, which is being faced with the question of actually what you want, and that being both exhilarating and an anxiety state.
And in order to act, we must have the feeling that what we want doesn't matter anymore, maybe.
We have to have the feeling that we can take the consequences of our choice. Not, the point isn't, because obviously choices don't come with guarantees, that's why they're choices. Right. So we take a choice which is exclusionary, and then we take whatever the consequences happen to be.
But also you suggest, and you're not the only one, I think his biographer does the same, that this illness that Kafka developed was also liberation.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think that he had a very impoverished view of what liberation might be. I mean, in the sense of what, as mortal creatures, can we possibly be liberated from? And I think that was what he was preoccupied by. Whether freedom actually does mean anything here.
I'd like to go to another story of Kafka you mentioned also in On Giving Up, the hunger artist. And you write about this short story that the hunger artist never gives up on wanting to fast, even though it's going out of fashion as a popular entertainment. But in order to go on fasting, he must never die of hunger. To be a hunger artist means never to complete one's starvation. Just as in sadomasochistic relationships, the sadist must never kill the masochist because he needs to go on torturing him.
Yeah, well, in this configuration, which is a little oversimplified, the sadist and the masochist are mutually dependent. So if the sadist kills the masochist, it doesn't have a masochist there. So in a way, you could see the real anxiety, if there is such a thing, in the middle of all this, is about dependence. It's not necessarily about cruelty. It's about how much you can rely on the other person to be there, whatever it is, to be there for whatever it is you take it that you need. But that's the project. And of course, it's more, in some ways, more interesting than the hunger artist, because he, like all of us, is completely dependent upon his appetite. That's
maybe the biggest dependency is on our appetite.
There can't be another one.
There can be another one.
No.
You quote a few times in your work the French philosopher Michel Serres. He wrote a book called The Parasite. And of course, a parasite is a creature that is dependent on the creature he's living on.
Yeah.
Would you say that in this relationship, whether it's between a sadomasochist and a masochist, or whether it's between the hunger artist and his hunger, that the cruelty is just a side effect of the dependency, or is it something more perverse?
The cruelty, well, as you know, there are lots of ways of looking at this. On the one hand, you could think the cruelty is despair about collaboration. I can only get what I want from this person if I bully them or torment them. On the other hand, if you believe something more metaphysical, you could think if aggression is not reactive to frustration, it's innate. There is a part of ourselves, and Freud believes this, whether or not we do, that there was a part of ourselves that wanted less life, not more life, and wanted to kill our vitality and kill our relationships and kill our commitment to other people. Well, that would be another description of this, I think. But I think certainly in the psychoanalysis that I've grown up with, it's fundamentally about dependence. That's the fundamental human problem, or one of them.
The fear of being alive, the fear of liveliness?
The fear of the fact that one's aliveness depends upon relations with other people. So the things one most wants and needs require relationship.
So the fear of being alive, the fear of this sensation, is in the end just the fear of the other person, on whom you might be dependent.
I think this in a way, it seems to me, explains, in inverted commas, misogyny. Because the conscious experience is, I hate this woman. What I really hate is my need for this woman, which is displaced onto the woman. So I really believe it's the woman I hate. Well, actually, what I really hate is my need for her. And this is obviously the source of terrible havoc and cruelty and so on and so forth. But I think what one's, and again, the generalizations can't be true because they're not. But if there was a generalization here, it would be, it's all about whether we can survive and transform our dependence. Because the official story is, we begin absolutely dependent, we then become relatively independent, and then in old age we become very dependent again. The truth is, we're always equally dependent, but it takes different forms. But fundamentally, we're dependent creatures.
The fundamental dependency never fades away.
Yes.
But
yeah.
You also write about the children, that, speaking of cruelty, that they have the desire both to love the parents and to kill the parents.
Yeah.
So basically, we all start with a certain amount, with this confusion where love ends and where cruelty begins.
Well, this is where ambivalence comes in, if you like. Because in the psychoanalytic story, only if you love somebody will you hate them, because only somebody you love can frustrate you. So in that story, ambivalence is fundamental. We're never going to get round the fact that where we love, we hate, and where we hate, we love. That one seems less obvious, but it nevertheless, I think, is the case. So that it's about whether we can survive our ambivalence, or whether we can bear the fact that we want to harm the people we love because we need them.
But we must give up on the hope that we can love without hate.
We must give up that hope and the hope that we can control the people we need.
They go together, no?
They go together, exactly.
One more thing about Kafka, and then I will let go of him. You write also about Kafka that he gave up all the women he thought of marrying. Of course, famous Felice Bauer is, I think, one of the most horrendous stories and letters. But he could not give up on the theme of giving up. So even when he writes about the perennial theme of finding a way of giving up on suffering, one's own and the suffering of others, he finds a way around it that seems at once ingenious and true. You can withdraw from the suffering of the world, that possibility is open to you and accords with your nature. But perhaps the withdrawal is the only suffering you might be able to avoid. Yeah. I find this a very...
So do I. It's a great comment.
Yeah.
It's a very, very interesting comment, because what it acknowledges is that the acknowledgement of suffering, one's own and other people's, is the medium of contact between people. So it's not that vulnerability is the problem, it is the point, it's the medium. So Winnicott said a very interesting thing where he said, I know I'm beginning to succeed in the treatment when I've managed to facilitate the patient abandoning their invulnerability.
Who said it?
Winnicott. So it's all about, in this story, it's all about the wish for invulnerability as a protection against dependence. Yeah.
So we must give up the hope on being able to love and without hate, and also we must give up the fantasy that we can be invulnerable.
Exactly, and that we can actually live without the people we need, love and like.
On this fantasy, on this treatment, on this basically escape, Kafka escaped the women he courted, always. Speaking of love and hate, that's also interesting.
Well, it's a terrible self-deprivation, isn't it?
It is.
That in a sense, what he became addicted to was the project of giving up. He couldn't let him become addicted to a woman.
Yeah. And then you summarize this all by saying that Kafka at the end was giving up forbidden pleasures. But are there pleasures that are not forbidden?
Plenty.
Plenty.
It would seem to me most pleasure. I mean, in a way, I think one of the things that's happened, and there may be lots of reasons for this, is an excessive privileging of forbidden pleasures, as though real pleasure is forbidden pleasure. And of course, if you believe in the Oedipus complex as the origin of sociability, that's what you believe. Whereas it could be the case that there's a tremendous anxiety that pleasure isn't pleasurable enough. So we have to do a lot of work to make us feel that pleasure is worth it. And of course, one way of doing this is to make it forbidden, because then it's even more exciting, even more dangerous. So there could be a wish to be endangered by our pleasures, as well as the fact we are endangered by our pleasures.
But can we truly enjoy pleasures that are not forbidden?
Lots of them.
This conversation.
We can enjoy having coffee, we enjoyed having breakfast. I mean, an awful lot of one's life is unforbidden pleasures. And indeed, a lot of political pleasures are unforbidden.
Can you give an example?
Well, voting.
Voting.
Or believing in justice. Or, I mean, none of this are people think, oh my God, can I risk this? At all. It just doesn't come out like that.
And this addiction of forbidden pleasures, if I may call it an addiction, that you said is deep in our culture?
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit unwilling to talk about our culture, because I don't know what our culture is.
It's quite common.
But broadly speaking, the people we know, let's say, it's the difference, I think, between wanting to lead a sexual life and wanting to lead an affectionate life. And of course, there'd be lots of people who would say, well, affection is a refuge from desire and all that stuff. Maybe it's true, and true for some people. But it could also be true that we might have valorized sexuality at the cost of affection. And that may be, for some people anyway, a better way of making sense of the lives they want.
And affection is one of the not forbidden pleasures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You quote Freud about pleasure, and you said that pleasure, you place Freud against Karl Marx, that pleasure is the main thing worth surviving for, whereas Marx said the social justice.
Yeah.
But also you write that we don't know what pleasure is.
We do and we don't. I mean, I think that those kind of statements are absurd in a way. I think the thing that Freud is drawing to our attention is what, if any, are the pleasures that sustain us? You know, because if we are not religious people, it's not obvious why we should bother to suffer. You know what the point of it is. Why suffer at all? So I think Freud, and not only Freud clearly, is interested in what pleasures we have that actually sustain us. And that means make us go on feeling that our lives are worth living. And are there any? And that seems to me to be an important and interesting question. Because children, as we know, are really hedonists. They really have pleasure-oriented lives. But something happens at adolescence. It's not a mystery what happens in adolescence.
It's really mystery.
But there is a mysterious element in it, that once sexuality enters, then tremendous anxiety enters about pleasure.
Okay, interesting. We were all born hedonists, but the moment sexuality enters into our lives, catastrophe happens.
Yes, the moment dependence enters our life, and then sexual dependence and sexual craving, then it becomes very much more complicated. And then it becomes a question of how much frustration you can bear and what you can turn your frustration into.
But can we really say that the dependency of a child vis-à-vis the parents is completely asexual?
No. I wouldn't suggest that at all. But I think that the risk is of thinking, as Freud seemed to suggest sometimes, that it's mainly sexual. I mean, it's quite clear that children are sexual creatures, as in they're sensuous creatures. But they also know, well, it's not who knows what children know, but there is a limit to what they can know about sexuality. It doesn't mean they don't have lots of fantasies about it. I mean, there's a very interesting French-Hungarian analyst called Béranger, I think, who said, if the father permitted the son to sleep with the mother, it couldn't work, because the child doesn't have the physiology, and in that sense, neither does the mother. So in this sense, the father's prohibition is a protection of the child's future potency, as if to say, you have to wait to do this, and you've chosen the wrong object.
So basically, by preventing the child of sleeping with the mother, you also protect the child.
Yes, absolutely. And you protect the child's potency. And the implicit message is, you have to wait, and you do have to wait.
Speaking of pleasure, you quote Freud again in his book, that one of the uses of psychoanalysis is the question, why are so many people addicted to their own suffering? And it is very well possible that this suffering is a source of pleasure as well, isn't it?
It is, yes. And I think that's one thing that psychoanalysis has very interesting stories about, because it would look as though, and Freud talks about this in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, it would look as though people come to see psychoanalysts because they actually want to be cured. They want their suffering to be diminished. What Freud discovered, and not only Freud, was that actually not merely do people not want to be cured, they actually enjoy their suffering. So to ask somebody to give up their suffering can be a terrible deprivation.
It's basically asking to give up a lover.
Exactly, and to give up the very thing that holds you together.
The suffering holds you together.
Yeah. And by that I mean, the fantasy is that if I wasn't suffering in this way, what would I become? What would I turn into? What would I be feeling?
What would be meaning without the suffering?
Yeah.
So what would you tell a patient who comes to you and says, Mr. Phillips, I'd like to get rid of my suffering. I suffer from this, and that. And you think, after talking to this man or woman for a few hours, this person enjoys his suffering.
Oh, I think I would and do think two things. I and they want to diminish their suffering, and I also know, I think I know, that they probably don't. So I work with their ambivalence. I'm not sitting there thinking, I know you really want to suffer.
That's a bit tough.
It would be absurd. But I think that people want both things, and that the aim of the analysis is to work out how they want these things.
How they want distance.
Yeah.
Distance from their own suffering.
Yes, and whether, but also, not only that, whether they can transform it into something else. You know, because the basic idea is always, the thing about traumatic experience is it stops you having experiences. Whereas the more interesting thought is, given life is intrinsically traumatic, what and when and how traumatic experience can be transformed into something of value. That seems to me to be the question.
Of course, it might be a cliche, but there's this cliche about art, that art is transformed suffering.
Yeah.
But can you give another example how you can transform your own suffering? Is this a way of playing is a very important word for Winnicott? Is this an attempt on behalf of that a psychoanalyst is trying to get the patient to play with his suffering?
Well, let's imagine, I mean, obviously this is totally abstract, but let's imagine somebody comes and they're very, very shy. They're chronically shy. In the process of the conversation, we may discover lots of things about this, because that person may feel, I am shy. There it is. And of course, they're partly right. But then we might find in the course of a conversation that being shy is a love test. Will people come and find me and talk to me and get to know me if I behave like this? It could also be true that actually I adore showing off. And in fact, so powerful are my exhibitionistic tendencies that I really need to clamp down on them. In other words, what happens over time is the symptom is unpacked. It's redescribed. It's seen to be serving lots of different functions. And it's seen to be a really brilliant artifact. These are fantastically interesting self-cures to real developmental problems.
You use the word symptom, quite important word for you in your work, also to others. You wrote that according to Freud, our whole sexual life is nothing but symptoms. Mm. So how can we get rid of our symptoms without getting rid of our sexuality?
Well, obviously these, to me, are wonderful pronouncements. When Freud says, our sexuality is a symptom, you think, God, what does that mean?
What does it mean?
Well, what it means is lots of things, but it means that the form our sexuality takes is transformed into sufficient suffering, partly. Sufficient, yeah. Also, our sexuality is a form of self-cure for something. So, for example, the pursuit of pleasure could be the pursuit of pleasure, but it could also be the wish to mitigate pain. So it could be being used in lots of different ways. Freud said to Ferenczi on a walk, and who knows if this is true, but Freud said to Ferenczi on a walk, tell me how a person makes love, and I will tell you everything about their character. Now, the everything bit, obviously, we can set aside, but nevertheless, it's an interesting account of sexuality as a kind of performance art. Performance art, presumably, partly in front of the parents, partly in front of oneself, partly in front of one's partner, and whoever else, but that something is being expressed as well as something being released. And I think, in a way, all Freud is saying is this is much more complicated than it seems, and much more interesting.
And something is also being hidden.
And something is always being hidden.
Always.
Because there's a limit to how much we can bear acknowledging the desires in our desire.
There's a limit of how much we can survive self-knowledge.
Yeah, and it may be the case that self-knowledge can be a decoy. You know, one of the great advantages of the other kinds of psychoanalysis, of which Winnicott is an exemplar, is that Winnicott clearly believes, and he's right, that self-knowledge is also a refuge, that the project is not self-knowledge, the project might be self-experience, and one might use so-called self-knowledge as a way of not having experiences.
Winnicott also believed that the whole meeting between patient and psychoanalyst was not so much about cure, but about an adventure, no?
Yes, absolutely. And so you could ask of a psychoanalysis, not what does it cure, I mean, you can ask that as well, but you can also ask, and what does it inspire, or what does it stimulate, or what does it create?
Let's get a bit more deeper into the basis of what psychoanalysis is. You write in your book, psychoanalysts write about people who seem to speak the same language. What Freud was to call the language of symptoms, we discussed that, and what Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, would call the unconscious structured as a language. How can...
Well, this is another example of, I think, a rather wonderful arresting comment. But of course, no one knows how a language is structured. And what Lacan is referring to here is, what does psychoanalysis look like if we believe it's fundamentally a linguistic medium? So it's all about language. And if you believe, I mean, there are various views about this, because obviously it takes us a very long time to speak. We don't speak till we're 2. And so we've had all that time not speaking, but growing up in a climate of words that we don't understand. So to begin with, language is music, presumably to us. It's sound. Gradually, we learn that it supposedly has meaning, but this is really very late in the day. But we talk as if it's, we know what's going on, sort of thing, between ourselves, but there's a sense in which we also don't, and that we're picking up tones and atmospheres and unconscious communications that may be at odds with the content, that clearly it's not about content, unless it's an order. But
it's an order.
Yeah, and clearly one of the fundamental models of language in this picture is orders. I say to you, pass me that glass, you pass to me. I think he's understood what I said.
Absolutely.
Because most of life is not like that.
So Lacan's symbolic order is basically the language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Lacan, and you quote this also in your book, I think in one of your books, also said that we are all victims of language.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how does that work? I mean,
well, I think the implication of the Lacan position is that we are basically, he says, captivated and tormented by language. Language is running our lives, we aren't. As though language has an autonomous life inside us. And so all our fantasies about agency, of course, are linguistically constructed.
So language is the master and we might be the slave?
Language is the master in this story, but there are no slaves.
Victims?
Yes, I mean, they could be described in all these ways, but it's still a very odd picture, that the very thing we're taken to be, because it's a sadomasochistic picture, we're basically tormenting ourselves.
And getting pleasure out of it. And getting pleasure out of it.
Yes, or finding a way of getting pleasure to make it bearable. It's not that I think in this story things are really pleasurable, it's that it's the masochistic point, which is, in order to make this bearable, I find a way of making it pleasurable. But actually, it is not bearable.
But if I believe I get pleasure out of this suffering, out of what's unbearable...
It keeps the show on the road.
And that's the most important thing, no?
For some people, sometimes, yeah.
Would you say that's the most important thing for you?
No. Because I think keeping the show on the road can be very impoverishing.
But it's the basic thing of surviving.
Well, when it is, and if it is essential, but the trouble is that the survival then becomes the ultimate rationalization for everything, as though what we really want to do is survive. And if we're Darwinians, obviously we believe this, we want to survive and then reproduce. But it would seem to me equally plausible that there may be other things that are worth doing that may be more important than surviving. Because if I want to survive, for example, I will betray my friend to the Nazis. But if I actually want to be a person that I value and want to protect certain values, I won't do that. Everything is not in the service of survival.
From the perspective of ethics, sometimes you have to give up your own life to
Absolutely.
Stay human. But
Yeah,
also
yeah.
You quote Freud, I think it's about desire, that we tend to value our desire so much that it's even more important than surviving. We die, not in order to protect our friend, but we die for our desire.
Yes, and it's amazing what people will risk for sexual gratification or for love. And obviously this is what all of Western literature is about.
Is it really amazing, or still to you?
Sometimes it seems amazing because of the intensity of the suffering. I mean, you could think there's nothing amazing about this is what it's like. But people are capable and want to suffer amazingly powerful things in order for certain desires to be gratified.
For the fantasy of pleasure.
Yeah, and not just the fancy, the experience.
For the feeling of being alive.
For the feeling of being alive and feeling that this makes me feel I'm alive, and B, being alive is worth being.
There's this other desire also that and you write quite a lot about it, that we don't want to feel alive. We don't want our language to be alive. I quote again from On Giving Up, Dead or Alive. We may wonder what it is in ourselves that might want to deaden language. Yeah. Or to put it the other way around, what the fear of aliveness in language may be a fear of.
Yes, and that seems to me very interesting.
Yes.
It's very striking if you are a psychoanalyst. If you read psychoanalytic literature, it's mostly fantastically boring. And the work itself is fantastically, wonderfully interesting in actuality. And so it's as though there's been a kind of unconscious plot on the part of people who write about psychoanalysis to deaden it. So you'd get no sense from psychoanalytic writing that people can enjoy each other's company, for example. So there's a good reason why we might developmentally partly want to render ourselves invulnerable to language, because it's so evocative, so powerful, so informative, etc. So it's as though it would be one of the things we might attack if we wanted to deaden ourselves. And the way we'd attack it would be by speaking cliches, not bothering to work out and articulate what it is we want to say. So
this cliche talk, this attempt that we all more or less say the same, that we copy what we see on YouTube, on Instagram, whatever, that this or in early days, maybe television, has a meaning.
Well, yes, the meaning would be, if we want to be simply the ventriloquist dummies of the culture, it means we are frightened of our own language.
And this means we are frightened of being alive.
Yes, we're frightened of the intensity of feeling involved in being alive. Yeah.
And this again is the fear of dependency, because
it's involved in it because it's dependency that sustains our aliveness.
You use a lot of literary works in your books. You go back also not only to Kafka but also to Henry James, The Wings of Dove. And there, based on that book, you make a quite interesting remark again, that this fear of life, this longing of being as dead as possible without dying, may lead to a state that we don't know, I quote you, Adam, we don't know what it is to have lived. And if that's the case, you ask the question, so what do we know?
Yeah,
so
I mean,
this is quite an existential abyss.
It is, but it's all. I mean, it's in plenty of literature, one way and another. But I'm sure people know this. But in The Wings of the Dove, Millie Teal, who is dying, and she's middle-aged, as far as we can tell, she is really panic-stricken about whether she's actually ever lived. And obviously it's a very, very interesting question, because how do you know? Or if you put it abstractly, the question is, what are your criteria such that you would think either I have lived or I haven't lived? But that it would be a question at all would seem to me to be the interesting point, that somebody could be in a predicament or get into a situation in which they really wonder, have I actually ever been alive? And in Winnicott's language, that would translate as, or be redescribed as, have I lived an entirely compliant life? A life devoted to meeting other people's demands at the cost of my own.
At the cost of my own.
Yeah.
I lived up to the fantasies of other people.
Yes, I was cast. In the central casting of life, I was cast as somebody. And of course, we're all cast because we grow up, and our parents, not because they're bad people, just they're people, they describe us. They give us descriptions of ourselves, and they stick, some of them, and the descriptions are there before we have the capacity to evaluate them. So I might think, I'm a very bad-tempered person. I'm a very shy person, and all this stuff. And this all comes from being described as such by one's parents. And one is described like this before one has the capacity to digest it. And it's very, very powerful.
So maybe one of the solutions could be that you have to escape other people's fantasies about yourself.
No, the solution is to have good conversations with other people.
Good conversations.
Yeah.
And that's where psychoanalysis might help.
Yes, it might.
That might help. On the one hand, you suggest, and I think rightly so, of course, that we are willing to suffer a lot for our desires, for the sense of being alive. But also you write, the implication of all this, what you just wrote, what we discussed, is, of course, that we might be unconscious, we might be radically unaware of how dead we are and want to be.
Yeah.
So how do I see these two wants, these two desires? On the one hand, the desire of the sensation of being alive, the attempt of getting the sensation of aliveness, whether it's in language or in life, and of course we cannot separate language and life as we just have seen. On the other hand, you said we are unaware how, on an unconscious level, how dead we want to be.
Well, one way of understanding this is to wonder what and who we really enjoy, who we really look forward to seeing, what we really enjoy doing. I mean, this is the point in a way of selective attention, which is that we know, we hear, read lots of things, we meet lots of people and so on, but some people stick. Some things we overhear really stay with us. And the nature of selective attention, I think, is important here. The question is whether you can follow up what you're struck by, whether you can see it through. Because everybody has very acute selective attention, even though obviously we're discouraged from having it. And so that would be a clue to this, which is, what am I really, really interested in? And can I bear the consequences of that interest? Because, of course, if you pursue it, it requires a certain amount of ruthlessness in relation to other people.
So you have to accept that you discard certain interests that are less important to you.
Yeah.
And there's a certain amount, you use the word ruthlessness, which to me, in my ear, almost in the realm of cruelty.
Well, it's terrible, but it might involve that. There's an interesting paragraph in one of Winnicott's essays where he talks about what he calls the creative artist. Now, this is hard to know what that means, but anyway, the creative artist, in his account, is somebody who can bear the ruthlessness of their need to make things or to do certain things. The risk would be that I might, as it were, make it this as simple as possible, love painting, but I might feel, actually, I've got to devote my life to looking after my dying mother. Now, see, I might want to devote my life to my dying mother, but the risk could be that it would be at great cost, and I would be left resentful at having betrayed myself. I betrayed my real desire.
And that's where the suffering kicks in.
Yeah.
The suffering that I have never been alive.
Yes, it could do. That's exactly where it could be. And were you to paint, then you might feel you'd been alive, but you'd hurt people, which you would have.
So maybe a good enough mother would say, son or daughter, go painting, I will die alone.
For sure, yeah. Because that mother, if and when she exists, would be more on the side of the child's development than on the side of her need.
So the child remains a child even if he or she is 40, 50, 60?
Oh, yeah, forever. Yeah.
You were a bit skeptical when I used the word survival, but you yourself write that our survival depends on not knowing about our desire, that we could only live by not knowing what mattered most to us, by not knowing what we most wanted. Our survival depends on this.
I mean, that's a bit extreme, it seems to me.
I know.
It seems a bit excessive, and it sounds interesting to me when you quote it back to me. And it must sometimes be true, because there are some desires that we are endangered by, and we know this. It's not a mystery, this. And then the question, I mean, this is all about one's repertoire of unconscious risks. both one's willingness to know about these risks and then one's capacity to take them or not. This is all about risk. It's all about what John Stuart Mill calls experiments in living, whether one is willing to make them.
And the risk of really knowing your desire is life-threatening.
Well, the risk of knowing your desires, you don't know what will happen to you. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen to us anyway, but we could have the illusion that we do.
So by knowing your desire, you give up on your quest for certainty, your quest for safety.
And your desire for prediction. You precipitate yourself into an unknowable future. Yeah. And you might think, this is a terribly idiotic thing to do. You know, you could perfectly plausibly think, actually, I want to know insofar as I can what's going on. I want to plan. I want to predict things, and I want a reasonably reliable environment. And Winnicott, not only Winnicott, but the line of those people is, if you've had a reliable, consistent upbringing, you will be free then to take risks. If you haven't, you won't be. That's the schema. It's not as simple as that, but that's the schema of it.
And the psychoanalyst is there to help the patient, to get him into a situation where he can bear to take risks.
The psychoanalyst is there to help the patient with what the patient wants help with. Otherwise, it's like joining a Maoist training camp. I mean, I might have lots of ideas about how people should live, but people are not coming to me so I can, one way or another, persuade them to do it. What I want to find out is what they want from me.
But you yourself keep on suggesting, keep on writing that we don't know what we want. You quote a few times Michel Serres.
Yes, exactly. But what that means is we don't know with any certainty. It's an ongoing experiment. And so the project, if you take this project seriously, is to go on wanting to find out where your real satisfaction is.
Yeah. Satisfaction or desire? Because they're not the same.
Oh, but no, they're not. But I think possibly both, as in the precondition for satisfaction is desire. And then you have to find out whether it works for you.
But satisfaction will always let you down, no?
It'll only let you down in the sense it won't be finally satisfying. Ideally, it'll generate a wish to go on wanting to be satisfied. Yeah, exactly.
Fear was already in the conversation, but I'd like to bring it back also to talk about fear and desire, because you write that according to Freud, the deepest, the primal fear was not that of castration, as Freud had proposed, but the absence, the loss of sexual desire. So basically our primal fear is that we will stop desiring, that there's nothing to desire anymore.
Yes, that we've made a world, or we're living in a world where there's nothing to want.
Yeah. A world where we don't miss anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in order to get away, in order to keep our desire alive, what are the strategies again? I mean, we keep on. How can we? What do we do in order to keep the desire alive?
Well,
that's also to keep the suffering alive.
Well, we have to be more or less attentive to what we think we want, and then we have to be more or less able to experiment with it and find out. If that's the kind of life you want. I mean, there are a lot of different ways of obviously living this, but this is the one that my psychoanalytic experience, and mostly my life experience, makes me value. I don't think this necessarily applies to anybody else. It might do.
Might. And I like this a lot. Your work is filled with paradoxes, and of course they're deep inside us, as I do believe. About pleasure, you say that of course it's the thing we seek, but also the thing we avoid. So basically the same with desire. On the one hand, we want with life that. On the one hand, we want this language to be alive, we want ourselves to be alive, but at a certain time we desire so much being that. So how can this I still try to get closer to this idea that we want pleasure and we avoid it at the same time.
There's a character in one of the Norman Mailer novels who says, you learn everything fighting your fear. So you could think, if I'm phobic or anxious, I must do the very thing I'm anxious about. That's the point. That my fear, it's stage fright. So my fear is a clue to the fact that I've apprehended unconsciously that the other side of this fear, there might be great pleasure or great experience. And the question is how much I'm willing to be tyrannized by my fear, whether I believe it. It's like guilt. The question is whether you believe your guilt is telling you the truth about yourself or is just a part of yourself that wants to punish you.
It's a matter of belief always.
Yeah, absolutely. You certainly don't take it literally.
Stage fright, that's a good word. You end your book with a beautiful aphorism on stage fright. And about loss. You write, when loss is not catastrophic loss, it is just a form of stage fright. So all the little losses we experience in life are just like rehearsals, dress rehearsals for a final loss? Is this what you are implying?
Well, I don't know if there is a final loss. I mean, except the final loss must be the loss of people one loves. I mean, I don't think, so people vary about this, but I don't think of my own death as a final loss.
You don't think about your own?
No.
How do you think about your own death?
It seems rather appealing to me.
Appealing?
Yeah. I mean, like everybody, I dread the suffering that getting there might entail.
Yeah.
But I think getting to a state where it is as though one has never lived seems to me wonderful.
Because the suffering finally has been avoided?
No, just because sleep is wonderful. Oblivion is wonderful.
Oblivion.
I don't mean it's better than other things, but it is wonderful.
And all our attempts to get into desire, to get pleasure, are in hindsight then just like mistakes or adventures?
No, it depends on each individual. I mean, you might think, I want to get as much as I can out of my life. Or I might think, I'm going to try and get away with this. Hopefully I'll get through it. And obviously this depends a bit on one's upbringing and a bit on the world one inhabits and so on. I don't think there's any one good life here, but I think it is good to live in a culture where there are a range of descriptions of good lives.
Would you say that when you were 20 or 30, that your own death seemed to be pleasurable, seemed to be this oblivion attracted you then also? Or is this a matter of...
I think when I was younger, it was entirely an abstraction. I never really thought about it, or what I would think of as really thinking about it. And I was fortunate enough because I didn't have friends who died when I was young. And that, I'm sure, would have made a huge difference to this. But I lived as though I was immortal, as, you know, Hazlitt said. As we all do. Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, Hazlitt said, until the age of 30, every person is immortal. And it's kind of true, depending on who you are, and your history and so on.
Is this distinction between catastrophic loss and not catastrophic loss, is this durable? Is this really, can we really make the distinction? Can you say to a patient, listen, you talk about loss, yes, I listen to you, I hear you, but it's not catastrophic loss. It seems to you catastrophic, but it's not.
No, I wouldn't want to be persuading anybody either way about this. I might be, in certain circumstances, persuading people that they might be taking refuge in loss as a way of not living something else. But I would basically want to enable them to find out what it is they are actually feeling.
Fear. Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Yeah. You said that you have to get into your fear, you have to overcome your fear.
Well, you can't help. I mean, everybody has that experience. We all know about that.
And forgive me, but you do the same. You go back to Kafka also, this story, The Swimmer, where a very interesting story where a swimmer in one of Kafka's stories becomes a champion without being able to swim. Yeah. And then you write, the joke, if it is a joke, is that heroism may be a function of incompetence. Also interesting. Or that we have only winners because we are losers. Or that being the best at something is being unable to do it.
Well, apart from anything else, it's a great account of development, because the implication is that we are all the stages of our own development. So even though I can swim, I once couldn't swim, and therefore there is a part of me that can't swim. And I like that idea that there's an accumulating history which creates all these states and stages. So in myself somewhere, I know what it is to be unable to speak.
And it's quite important to remember that.
Yes, I think it probably is.
In order not to be a victim of language.
Otherwise you get hypnotized by speaking. It's as though we're just all doing this together and it's fine and it works, which often it does, but that isn't the only thing that happens.
But being hypnotized by speaking by language, isn't this also what seduction is?
Yes, I think it probably is. But I think the dispiriting thing would be to have one's pleasure in language diminished by assuming it's straightforward, that you'd lose the ambiguity and the power of it.
The want, not the desire, in order to keep you right, in order to want something is to be left out of having it. So in order, this whole thing, before we get into this beautiful state of oblivion, all the time we want something. We desire something, whether we call it want or desire. But in order for this want to remain alive, we must be left out of something.
Well, there has to be an experience of lack.
Yeah.
I must be aware of something that I don't have as a way of finding out what I might want.
Yeah.
So there's the precondition is exclusion or frustration. And out of that, you may be able to work out what you want.
And then you go back to our childhood, the childhood of everybody. You said the sexual acts between the parents is the first party that we are not invited to, our first party. The first time that we are left out is when our parents have sex.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as a child, again, the generalization can't be true, but as a child, you know that your parents have some kind of pleasure or do something together that you don't know about, but that it's clearly very exciting. You know, your mother adores you and tells you how much she adores you, and every night she goes to bed with your father. This is a completely baffling experience.
It's baffling.
So, and that's going to be a preoccupation somewhere. And of course, and this is also part of the incentive of growing up.
Yeah.
You know, why grow up? Well, they can do things that we can't do, and that sound very exciting.
Yeah. That's baffling. I have to tell you, my mother left my father and came to sleep in my room when I was a young child. So, yeah, I didn't have the feeling to be completely left out, but that's...
No comment.
No comments, no comments. Identity. You write also a lot about identity. I think it's a very important theme, especially in these days. And it has to do something with the absence, with feeling excluded, because you make the comment, another aphorism I would say, that identity, like exclusion, I start a bit earlier, or even that so-called identity may be our self-cure for experience of exclusion, of being left out. That identities are the artifacts we make as a solution to being left out. We organize ourselves around these experiences of exclusion, and we narrow our minds to deal with them. And identity, like exclusion, makes us violent. Please explain, how does it work?
Well, I think the question in this is, why does one want to be recognizable to oneself? Or why does one want to acquire a preferred picture of oneself, which one is then going to defend? Because in some ways you can think this is a very odd idea. Because, again, the risk, to my mind, of this would be that the idea of acquiring an identity is, again, a radical oversimplification of oneself. And it might make oneself too recognizable, supposedly, to oneself and others at the cost of parts of oneself that are not. I mean, if you think of this developmentally, parenting is a very acutely form of selective attention. Our parents pick out, this is unconscious, but they pick out the parts of ourselves they love, like, desire, find acceptable, beautiful, etc., and they encourage those. And the parts of ourselves that they are disturbed by, or don't like, or want to discourage, they either ignore or they discourage. But that means we are then the products, so to speak, of very powerful forms of selective attention. And we then, I imagine, spend our lives finding people who will be able to see things in ourselves that our parents couldn't see, and avoiding those people because we're fearful of it. But those are that's the range, if you like.
That's the mechanism.
Yeah. And clearly, acquiring an identity in childhood, becoming the person they want us to be, is very useful but very estranging at the same time.
But is it possible to acquire an identity that would not be violent? And do we need a fixed identity?
Well, yes, if you could acquire an identity that didn't make you violent in the defending of it. Because the risk is one has somewhere in oneself a fundamentalist account of oneself that cannot be broached.
You also quote Freud, who said that whatever you say you are not.
Yes, and Lacan says this. And it's useful to have that in the picture. That there's always going to be more to you than you're aware of. And some of this will frighten you, and some of it needn't.
On Giving Up, you write that one of the aims of psychoanalysis is that we should be more curious about our own suffering, or we're not curious enough.
And about other people's.
And that was a bit of a strange remark to me, because I believe that we live in a world, in a society where people speak all the time about their suffering, relentlessly, but they're not curious. Speaking about suffering is not the same thing as being curious about
No, exactly. I think that's right. And there is a real distinction there. Because the risk is that the suffering becomes a kind of pornography, that it becomes a familiar, slightly exciting environment. I mean, we're all in this now.
Yeah. That's the world we live in, yeah. That's the children are, you write in your chapter on not believing in anything, are profoundly ambivalent about their curiosity.
About?
Their curiosity. They know
Yeah.
that they want to know something, and at the same time they know that they don't want to know many other things, and maybe the same thing.
Yeah.
And you suggest, or you write explicitly, that adults are the same.
Well, children know a lot about what their parents suffer. It's not formulatable, it's not representational, but they know, I think.
Yeah.
And so there is a wish. I mean, we've all failed in life because we've failed to cure our parents. And the curiosity...
Excuse me, we failed to?
Cure our parents.
To cure.
And the curiosity is ambivalent. On the one hand, we want to know about our parents, but we are really frightened to find what we'll find out. And we're right, because it'll be in excess of our capacity to manage. And I think that's it. You can never know whether you'll be able to cope with what you discover through your curiosity. So it's a risk. It would have to be.
But a child feels, probably on a very unconscious level, that his task, that he is alive, he is on this world in order to cure his parents.
That's one of the things. He's also on this earth to develop. Yeah. But in my view, curing one's parents is one primary project in development. And one that everybody
And then we
fails
find
at.
out that we are unable to do it. Also maybe because we prefer painting to curing our parents.
Maybe, or we find something else. Or we can bear to abandon our parents to their lives. Or to their partners.
And is this what we find, this finding something else? Would you say this is just an alternative for curing our parents?
Yes, but also it's the alternative that our development depends upon. Because given we're all, if this is true, we're all ambivalent about our development and also want to attack it, then we can recruit our parents to stop us developing, or we can carry on. We can abandon our parents.
This desire, this wish not to know, we can describe it also by another word. You write a lot about it, a whole chapter. Censorship, the pleasures of censorship. And you imply that without a censor, we would not be able, without being a censor having in ourselves, we would not be able to experience pleasure. Or you said, but what the censor knows, I quote you again, whether as Freud himself seems to, is that we're endangered by our desire. We've discussed this, but our desire is the only thing that really matters to us. And Freud will go on to suggest, however absurd it may sound, and we discussed all that our desire can be more important to us than our survival. But what's the function of the censor exactly? How does it function?
What's the function of
the censorship inside us?
Well, the function of the censorship is to make desire viable, is to create a space in which one feels sufficiently safe to desire. Because it's as though the internal feeling is one's capacity to desire is precarious. And so it needs quite a lot of protecting. One's preconditions for being able to desire might feel very, very unreliable. So one's working hard at some level to make it work for oneself.
So without this inner censorship, we won't be socialized, of course, but we also would be unable to wish, to desire, to want
Yes,
something.
we could be too frightened to. It could be excessive. It could feel excessive. There's a very interesting English philosopher called Mary Midgley who says, well, as we know, one of the strange things about human beings as animals is that our sexuality is not periodical. It's all over the place. And she says, sex should be like Christmas shopping, something you do every so often, but you don't assume it's something you should or want to do all the time. And this is another version of the same question, which is, given we are animals, it's as though we've become very strange animals in relation to sexuality.
So the censor is also basically the thing agency that is helping us to avoid extremes.
Yes, and to avoid excess. Or debilitating excess, yeah.
So it helps us to desire, it helps us to survive.
Yeah, and to survive our desire.
Yeah. Before we go to monogamy, I promise you that we will do this. I promise the audience we will go to monogamy. A few questions on another book that came out recently on wanting to change and on conversion. That's an important theme in that book. That conversion is, you're right, is symbolic murder, but it's also an act of love. That conversion, for Freud, I will quote this nice quote. Conversion for Freud is the best picture of the worst kind of adaptation, the sacrificing of sexual pleasure in the service of psychic survival. Yeah. So we discussed the censure, but how does the conversion works in this whole performance art life that we...
Freud talked about initially hysterical conversions, which means the way in which you convert desire into symptoms as a kind of compromise. So, if I want to look at naked women's bodies, I won't do that, but I'll keep rubbing my eyes. I'll acquire a symptom that will draw attention to my eyes, but will give no clue about what I want to do with my eyes. So hysterical conversion symptoms are like that. They're allusions to the desire they conceal. But they're ways of not endangering oneself and sustaining something of one's desire.
And where does the need to convert other people come from? Is this just an act of love? I mean, parenthood is also converting, you describe this in length, converting your children, basically.
Well, it's a form of omniscience. I mean, presumably, if the part of oneself that is in despair about collaboration and cooperation wants to convert other people. And it comes from the omniscient part of oneself. And certainly in psychoanalytic stories, the omniscient part of oneself is the most dangerous part of oneself, the most debilitating.
What's the most dangerous?
The omniscient part of oneself. The part of myself that believes, actually,
I know everything.
Really, I know everything, yeah.
You write also in Believe It or Not, chapter on wanting to change, the convert is always somewhere a triumphant hedonist. He is getting the best pleasure.
Well, yes, I think in this story, so to speak, someone else is always having the pleasure.
Someone else?
Yes, someone else. They're really having the exciting time. I mean, you can think of this quite simply. The envious part of oneself thinks, shit, why can't I do that? And the unenvious part of oneself thinks, how wonderful to live in a world where people can do things that I can't do.
And then you convert to the other.
Yeah.
Because you convert always, you write this, to the best life you can get, you think you can get.
That's what you believe, yes. Yeah. And the question would be why you need to convert. Presumably, it's a way of managing self-doubt. That if I can get everybody to agree with me, I've kept all my self-doubt at bay.
Converting is a way of getting rid of self-doubt.
Yeah.
And converting other people is the same.
Yes, and that's what it becomes. Yeah. But it's to do with, in a way, protracting one's omniscience.
You convert other people because you cannot live with your own self-doubt, your own insecurities.
Yes, and they represent dissenting voices. They represent the parts of yourself that might not agree. Yeah.
Is assimilation also, in a sense, an act of converting?
Yes.
So Freud was a converted Christian?
No, I don't think so. I think Freud was very exercised by assimilation. How could he not be? As was Kafka. And I think you can read a lot of psychoanalysis as being about tactics and techniques for assimilating without assimilating.
And the same, you write also that the same could be said about Kafka.
Yeah.
That's what they have in common.
Yeah.
Let's go to monogamy. I have it's a collection of aphorisms that came out quite a long time ago, 98, I believe. You ready?
Yep.
Infidelity is as much about the drama of truth-telling as it is about the drama of sexuality. It's only because of sexuality that we think about truth at all, that we find honesty and kindness at odds with each other. Lying, in other words, is not so much a way of keeping our options open, but of finding out what they are. Fear of infidelity is fear of language. That would come as a relief for all those people who are suffering from jealousy. They're just afraid of language.
To some extent, but there's no relief for people suffering from jealousy.
There's no relief. No.
I don't think so. I mean, I should just say as a preface, this is a young man's book. And I don't mean by that I want to disown it, nor that I don't believe things in it. But when you read it to me, it feels like it comes from another world.
Seriously? Yeah. Well, how come?
Well, partly because at that stage in my life, I was excised by monogamy. And it came very quickly, this book. I wrote it in like 3 days. And it was all there.
3 days,
this whole book?
3 days, the whole book. Wow. I mean, the whole book is not long, as you know.
No, I know, but still 3 days.
It has pages, but it's actually not long. But it was all there. Now, I assumed from that I had been thinking about this a lot. And I, as people of that age often are, I was very excised by this question. And I wanted to find a way of thinking about it. I wasn't thinking this at the time, but retrospectively, I think, I wanted to find a way of thinking about this that might not find a way out of the labyrinth, but find other ways of thinking about this. Because I was terrorized by the idea of infidelity at that point in my life.
Of infidelity?
My own and of the other person's. Yeah. And I thought, it's a version of something I felt when I was younger, which is if I was frightened of something, I sort of did it. Because I knew that if I didn't, I would just be stuck in my timidity. And I didn't want to do that. Well, I think I felt something similar here, that I couldn't live in the way I wanted to, tyrannized by the fear that monogamy had in it and fidelity had in it. It's not that I wanted to be a libertine, if you see what I mean. No. It wasn't like that. It was much more a question of how does one deal with this? Because it was obvious to me at 30 that even though I was with individual people that I loved, I could certainly love more than one person. And I could see why this wasn't viable and was an act of aggression, and also why it was exactly what I should be doing. And it was a conundrum we were all, my friends and I, suffering from in different versions. And some people shut it down by thinking monogamy is the thing, and fidelity is the thing. And I also was capable of believing that. And then sometimes not.
It's clear in this book that the author is not on one side or the other.
Yeah.
He's in between.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting that you say you were terrorized by the fear of infidelity. I just was in Vienna 6 weeks ago to listen to the Freud lecture. You gave the Freud lecture a few years ago. It's an annual event at the Berggasse where Freud used to live and work. This year it was given by Jan Kutzi, the Austrian South African author. And he said many things about jealousy, but one of the claims he made was that Freud was too fearful of getting into an affair. He very much wanted it, but he was so terrorized.
Yeah. Yeah, and the question would be, because obviously that begs the question, it doesn't answer the question, because, I mean, who knows if it was true. If it is true, the question is, what was he frightened of? And that's got, because it's not obvious what the fear is, but there is real fear involved in these things. And the speculation about Freud, in some ways, is rather, it's inevitable, but it's a bit odd. Did he have an affair with his wife's sister, and all this stuff? And the question would be, if he had an affair with his wife's sister...
His wife's sister was living in the house.
Yes, was living in the house. And he went on holiday with her. What would the effect of that be on our view of Freud? Or what might we read Freud differently? And I think there's a wish in this, which is this man who writes so much about sexuality, where's his?
Where's his sexuality?
As though it's like that.
It's absent.
It's apparently absent. Yeah.
It's apparently absent.
Yeah.
But you also write a lot about the presence of absence. It's quite important, not only in literature, but also in psychoanalysis. One more aphorism. At the beginning, number 18 is this. At the beginning of a love affair, one might ask, depending on which kind of person one is, a person who prefers the future or a person who prefers the past. What I'm getting into or what I'm getting out of. It's common sense to assume that every entrance is also an exit. So basically, every love affair is also an escape.
Well, an escape may be too harsh. It may be an attempt to go on solving a problem that the previous relationship revealed. Yeah. The one's involved in a sort of ongoing series of sort of questionings about oneself, I think.
Number 27. At its best, monogamy may be the wish to find someone to die with. At its worst, it's a cure for the terrors of aliveness. They are easily confused.
Yes, I agree.
You agree still, yeah? You're still happy about this one?
I'm happy with that one,
yeah. Okay. Let's end before I open up to the public with number 41, with hope. Suspicion, we are back again with jealousy. Suspicion is a philosophy of hope. It makes us believe that there's something to know and something worth knowing. It makes us believe there's something rather than nothing. In this sense, sexual jealousy is a form of optimism.
Well, there's something to know, A, and B, if I could know it, my life would be better. So it really reassures one about something about curiosity. Yeah. Because the fear might be, there's nothing to know.
There's nothing.
Yeah, there's just
That's
nothing
the
worth
worst
knowing.
thing.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing worth knowing.
Yeah, which is the version of, there's nothing worth desiring.
Yeah. And hope is the feeling, the sense that there is something worth knowing. That knowledge is worth pursuing.
Yes, or that there is something we're looking forward to. And part of that might be knowledge. Something we want to find out. Something that finding out will make our lives better.
Yeah. That may also be the case that we want to turn our fear, which is the same basically as our fantasy, into reality.
Yes, that we may not want to be tyrannized by our fear.
We may not.
We may, but we may not.
We may not. What exactly is the difference between fear and fantasy?
Well, I think fantasy, fear is formulated in fantasy, if you see what I mean. But of course, fantasy is much broader than fearfulness. There's a greater range. But I think it must be true, probably, that an awful lot of fantasy somewhere is informed by fear. And the question would be, and what's the fear in this? It's not the only thing in it, but it must be something in it, I think.
So maybe we can conclude that fear is also part of desire. There's always something.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because there's got to be a risk in desire.
There's got to be a risk.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the desire is forbidden.
No, it doesn't.
But
it just means one doesn't know the consequences of one's desire.
That's a hopeful note, at least in my ear. Let's open a discussion to the public, if that's okay with you. Jante will walk around with a mic. Again, you can ask questions. If you stand up, you raise your hand.
Oh, okay. We talked a lot about fear and the fear of the consequences of what you want, or the fear of living. And I was just curious, is fear a natural state that we're born with? Is it something, and why? Or is it something that we acquire in our development? And if so, why do we acquire it? Why does it play such a dominant role?
I think it must be both. But I think without fear, we'd be extremely vulnerable, in the sense that fear is a bulletin about what might be endangering us, and why, therefore, we may need to be vigilant. So it's hard to imagine a life without fear, and that fear's giving us very important bulletins from ourselves, about ourselves. The risk is that fears become fantastical rather than realistic. I mean, you may know this, but in psychoanalysis, Freud talks about anxiety more than fear, because he seems to believe that fear is too immediate, so we displace it. So we find it in something else. So I might, for example, be phobic of pigeons. Now, Freud, I'm not, as it happens. Freud would say, obviously it's obvious, pigeons are not dangerous, but in this story, I have attributed to pigeons very, very dangerous things. So they become the carriers of a part of myself that I'm frightened of, which is probably something to do with aggression. So I become pigeon phobic. So I don't think I'm anxious about X, Y, and Z. I think I'm frightened of pigeons, and all I then got to do is avoid pigeons. So it's very efficient in a certain sense. But what it doesn't do is help me know what it is about myself that I'm actually disturbed by.
In the English-speaking world, it has now become common to approach psychoanalytic training from a non-psychiatric or clinical psychology background. And I think your background was also from English. But in other countries, it's still very much psychiatry and clinical psychology. Do you think this is causing a rift within the psychoanalytic theories? And how do you think it's impacting?
Well, the trouble with this is you're going to get a very prejudiced answer to this question, because obviously this is integral to my and other people's history who's trained. I found, and you must take this to be entirely prejudiced, I found psychiatry to be virtually a non-profession. I thought it was full of shit. I thought it was a radically misleading account of what was going on inside people and between people. I mean, I've met some amazing psychiatrists, that's also true. But for me, and this must be a question of sensibility more than anything else, I found a psychoanalytic approach was much more appealing to me and, as it happens, more useful. Because I think the medicalization of psychoanalysis has really undermined it, because it appears to produce a supreme fiction, if you see what I mean. And of course, it's all about anxieties about supreme fictions. It's all about authority. So you can't legitimately, within psychoanalysis, have people who are authorities. You can't be an authority on the unconscious, or on sex, or indeed on life. And so for me, the appealing thing about psychoanalysis was precisely that it's a very limited kind of expertise, if it's an expertise at all. I also, of course, grew up in a period of anti-psychiatry, which was very important for me and people of my generation, in which people like R.D. Laing and Kuperness and all these people, who were very, very interesting people, were giving very, very articulate, eloquent accounts of the ways in which psychiatric diagnoses were part of the problem and not part of the solution. So if somebody said to me, what's the best preparation for training to be a psychoanalyst, I would say philosophy, literature, history, social work, but definitely not medicine. And if you happen to be a medical doctor, that's a great thing to be, and it can help. But it's certainly not going to be replacing psychoanalytic listening, in my view.
Supreme fiction, I like that. You're, in one of your books, you also write that you can never be an expert on psychoanalysis.
Yeah. Everyone's a student of psychoanalysis, and that's one of the great things about it. Yeah, we're all adding our 2 cents worth.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about, sort of meta question about your experience of your own language in 3 different modes. So the experience you have of speaking in, say, this setting, your experience of writing, and your experience of being with patients. Do you recognize yourself as being somehow different in these 3 settings when you hear yourself speak? Is it a different kind of language, or are we getting a version of what it would be like, for example, to be your patient?
I think in a way you're asking the wrong person, because I just do it all, if you see what I mean, and I can't really accurately reflect on it. It feels all of a piece. In other words, when I'm doing psychoanalysis and when I write, things occur to me. I am dependent upon what occurs to me. And that's what I rely on. And I can describe that as, unconscious processes, or I can describe it lots of ways. I don't know what it is, but I do know something comes from nothing. It can't literally be nothing, but it feels like nothing. So I started as a child analyst, and that was my training. And so the linguistic thing was not as central. I'd studied literature at university, where, of course, the linguistic thing was central. But I went into child analysis because that's what really interested me. And of course, a lot of it was about not verbalization. A lot of it was about playing, and a lot of it was about, as it were, feelings. But I've never found myself, and this is really not a boast, struggling to articulate things. Not because I can articulate anything, but because it doesn't feel like that's what I'm doing. It feels like I'm just talking or just writing. And that, I think, is why I enjoy doing it, because there isn't effort in it. I couldn't try at it any more than you can try in a psychoanalytic session to listen. You're either receptive or you're not. But it's that way around. And I assume people learn to write from reading. That's really, I think, how I've learned to write. Yeah. And also, I had one wonderful editor at the London Review of Books who edited in a way that was, to me, kind of a revelation. And she showed me, very minimally, how a sentence could be improved. And I really did learn something from that. But broadly speaking, you learn it by doing it, I think.
Many of these essays have been published in LRB before they...
Sorry?
Many of these essays have been published by the London...
absolutely.
But maybe also the gentleman is asking the questions, are you still taking new patients?
Yeah.
You are? Okay.
Oh, no. Oh, no, hold on.
No.
I'm not. I'm, in fact, retiring in a year's time. So I have taken on new supervisees, but not new patients.
Okay. Good to know.
Ik heb hier nog een vraag. I'm going to read it. I'm curious on your thoughts on the ritual in relation to our dependency of each other. It seems to offer the possibility to escape the fear by offering a concrete form, but maybe it's a medium to be able to stay with the fear or something completely different.
I think it's going to be different for each person and each couple and so on. But I do think that if you can bear it and bear with it, you may find something out. Because the risk is having a phobic reaction and taking flight before you've actually experienced it. Because the initial reaction can be almost phobic. I can't bear this and I've got to get out. And I think if you can hold that threshold, you might discover something. Because I think it's all about that. I mean, you may know this, but there's a very interesting British psychoanalyst called Bion. And Bion talks about there being two relationships to frustration. On the one hand, evacuation, you just want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. On the other hand, he says that the preferable solution, so to speak, is thought. That we are enabled to turn our frustration into thinking, into representation, and indeed into conversation. So it becomes built in as a sort of ongoing struggle, if you like, but with the assumption that dependence is the only medium that we can actually live in. There's nowhere else to live.
Conversation with whom? Anybody?
Anybody you feel is worth talking to.
Yes, thank you. It's more like a clarification question about language again. I think you said, you talked about the intensity of the suffering of language, and then later on there was at one point something about talking about suffering, but without being curious about suffering. So I was just wondering if it's possible that you have patients, or one might have patients, who come and speak in cliches because of this fear of the intensity of language, or because they are not yet curious about their own suffering, if there's something in parallel between those two things. And if in psychoanalysis there might be a point when, if things work, people go beyond this fear to some extent, and perhaps is there one thing that might play a role, or a number of different things, or perhaps that goes too far? Thank you.
Well, I assume that if people are broadly speaking talking cliches, it's because they're frightened. But my wish then would be to, insofar as I'm able to, enable them to speak more broadly. And this is where free association is very, very useful. Because when people speak in cliches, obviously they speak on topic. And they speak about something. If you encourage people to literally say whatever comes into their minds, lots of things open up in very different and unpredicted ways. Because you can't free associate in a cliched way, if you see what I mean. It just isn't like that. So that's the project for me. But I also want to find out from any given person whether they want to do that. Because it's an obvious point, but what I'm wary of is that psychoanalysis becomes another ideological brainwashing. I basically know how you should live, and so I'll teach you, broadly speaking. Well, I think psychoanalysis is much more interesting than that, because in a way, it facilitates things rather than teaching them. And that, for me, is what's interesting about it. It's a very different way of two people being together. Just finding out what people can say and think and feel in each other's presence if they don't have sex with each other. And it's very, very interesting and revealing that.
So basically it's overcoming the censorship inside you.
Yes, it is a version of that, and finding out what, and it's very specific. It's about, what forensics called a dialogue of two unconsciouses. So it's much more goes on between the analyst and the patient than what is said. It's much more than the content, but something happens between people. And that's what you try and reflect on. Yeah.
You can never convert to psychoanalytical thinking.
No, the problem is that people who train, what should happen is people should grow through psychoanalysis and then repudiate it. But what often happens is people are trained and then they join the psychoanalytic army. And then it becomes a very, very powerful, narrow group of people who are very cross if they're challenged. And this is not good. So it's much better if people make something of their own of it. And the really interesting psychoanalysts are all people who've made something of their own of it. If you read Lacan, Winnicott, or Bion, these people really are using it to do something of their own with, to speak their own language.
Yeah.
Hi there. I really hope this question builds forward on your last answer. I was curious, to what degree and in which ways do you think psychoanalysis has a part to play in overcoming the tension between political philosophy paralysis out of cynicism and the apparent impossibility of actual revolution? And I mean, take political philosophy as in the care for self and others versus the seemingly universal feeling of being restrained in both the private and the public. So I mean this either directly or in an analogy to politics. Is there any way that psychoanalysis can render a shared discourse, even if it is born out of vulnerability?
Well, I hope so. I mean, psychoanalysis, in my experience, even though it's very interesting, is strangely irrelevant to politics. It never seems to properly make a difference. But what I do think psychoanalysis is about at an individual level is one's relationship to individual tyranny. And so my wish is, and it may only be that, is that people who have psychoanalysis gradually evolve a different relationship to authority, and they're less compliant. So they're able to think about what is acceptable to them and able to act on that frustration if they feel it. But I think it's politically almost mute, and I think this is a terrible thing.
Do you know, would you have a solution or idea how we can unmute the psychoanalytical thinking in the political world?
I think it's partly because the analytic pose of neutrality. This is a real problem in and of itself. Of course, there's no such thing as neutrality, but it looks as though there is. I think it would be better probably in certain circumstances if analysts declared themselves. I mean, at the moment, you can have this both ways as an analyst. People come and they talk about the world, which is catastrophic, and you acknowledge that. If you say, I'm not saying this is all about your childhood, I know this is how you're experiencing it. But I can also say, and what might you be using this as a language to talk about? Because clearly there's more to us than what's going on in the Middle East, even if what's going on in the Middle East might be very, very, very absorbing. And so that's the kind of space I would want to create in analysis itself, that you can see you're doing at least two things at once. You're thinking about the world and caring about it, but you're also using it as a language to talk about something that's much more specifically to do with your individual history.
Maybe a bit smaller.
Yeah.
Sure. The last question, I would say.
Yeah, I had a question about the relation between a cliché and also a role model. So I was thinking, like, in language, you have a cliché, and it could be out of a fear of speaking one's own mind or like hiding behind words. But is a role model not kind of similar, that it's kind of a person that you kind of, like, you're afraid of being yourself, so you act like a role model. So you mentioned, like, you have a fear of speaking, so you have a cliché, but a role model in itself can be good. So I don't get how that can be different.
Anna Freud had this concept of identification with the aggressor. And in this story, she said that when children are frightened of anybody in their childhoods, they identify and become the aggressor as a way of assuaging their fear. Now, it would seem to me the thing about identification is, at its best, it's not somebody literally modeling themselves on somebody else. It's somebody using that other person, using the bits of the other person that feel useful to them, as opposed to using them literally as a model. So good identification is partial and very selective. Bad identification is just straightforward imitation. And you know, in a psychoanalytic sense, imitation would be the problem, not the solution. So there's a whole range of psychoanalysts who believe that the treatment involves the patient internalizing the analyst as a good object, such that they've got this sort of guardian angel, so to speak, inside them. Well, from a lot of people, including my view, this is the problem, which is it's not that we should be like other people, even though we are like other people in lots of ways, but that we should be able to think about this. and be able to think about what it is about our parents that we value and love and like, and what it is about them we can't stand, and disidentify from that. But that it's thought out, not literally sitting in a room thinking, but it is selective rather than the wish to simply become enslaved.
Imitation might be another way of giving up.
Well, it's the thing Emerson said, imitation is suicide.
It's suicide. I'd like to thank the audience for being here on this balmy Sunday morning. It's impossible to summarize this conversation, but I think don't join the psychoanalytical army, but take psychoanalysis seriously and read the books by Adam Phillips, also his early books. And also we learned, maybe some of you knew this already, that we want to be alive and dead at the same time, so I should just remain alive in the morning, and after lunch for a few hours you can be dead. I hope you will come again to one of our conversations. Adam, thank you for being here. It was a pleasure talking to you, and get home safely. See you soon again. Have a good Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you.